are these changes occurring at the level of policy outcomes, the laws that Congress passes? So those are our questions. We ask, are more laws passed on narrow party lines? Are today's majority parties more effective at delivering on their policy agendas? To answer this question, we collected a number of sources of data on patterns of party support on enacted laws, as well as on parties' ability to carry out their agendas. And what we find, the short answer is no. They're not getting any better at delivering on their policy agendas. Parties' ambitions are frequently checked via veto players controlled by the opposing party. And second, contemporary parties, majority parties, are not as cohesive as they seem in the roll call data that I just displayed to you. I'll go through the evidence on each of these points. So this is I'll just highlight for you the sorts of data that Jim and I put together. We collected data on all passage votes on laws, both on routine legislation as well as on landmark legislation. So what's the breakdown? How many Democrats, what share of Democrats are in favor, what share of Republicans in favor? We also looked at party agendas. That's really the acid test of a party's effectiveness. Can it really legislate on what it truly cares about? And so in order to get at this, we read the speeches given by the Speaker of the House and the Senate Majority Leader at the start of the Congress. What issues did they highlight in those opening Congress speeches? And then we also looked at the bills that were slotted into the leadership bill numbers. So HR 1 through 10 and S 1 through 5, going back through the 1980s. And then just did legislative histories of each of those bills, asking the simple question, whether parties got most of what they wanted, whether they got a bill through but had to back down on key matters, so they got some of what they wanted, or whether they got none of what they wanted, meaning that the legislative effort failed altogether. And then for those issues on which they were successful, either partially successful or fully successful, we asked how they did it. And did they do so by steamrolling the other party, by passing legislation over the opposition of the other party, or not, whether they managed to get the other party on board in some way. So I'm going to show you a series of graphs displaying patterns in passage votes, House and Senate, and then I'll turn to the agendas data. So first, this is the size of the agenda. What we learn here is that there hasn't been any change over this whole period. It starts with the 99th Congress, 1985-86. No significant change in the size of the agenda that majority parties want to enact based on the measures that I described. There's also not a party difference. Republicans and Democrats put forward agendas that are roughly the same size when they each have the majority. So first, let's look at passage votes. This shows you the percentage of the minority party, voting in favor of legislation that successfully passes the Senate. I put a reference line at 50% because what that indicates to you is that when that percentage dips below 50%, that means that a majority of the minority party opposed it. And what you see here is that very rarely does legislation pass over a majority of the minority party in the Senate. That includes all laws, as well as landmark laws, as gauged by Yale political scientist David Mayhew. So he has a list going back to actually to the 40s of the most significant legislation that passed each Congress. So that's the Senate. This is the House. Once in a while, it dips below 50% on average, but not very often. The two outlier cases are the 103rd Congress and the 111th Congress. Those are Congresses with unified Democratic control under Bill Clinton in the 103rd and under Barack Obama in the 111th. So you might think, well, parties steamroll when they have unified government. Except you don't see the same pattern So starkly in the 108th and the 109th under unified Republican control with George W. Bush. So, in fact, with statistical analysis, there's not a statistically significant difference between unified and divided government in terms of the share of the minority party voting in favor of enacted laws. These next two figures look at the so-called roll rate. This is the frequency with which legislation is passed over the opposition of a majority of the minority party. So this is a frequency count. Again, most laws simply garner majority support from both parties. But unusual. There's the outliers again, the 103rd and the 111th. But in general, you don't see parties successfully steamrolling their opposition on legislation. Third measure, and this is true for the Senate as well. Third, we looked at we call it when the majority party needed minority party votes for passage. In other words, when looking at the final passage vote, did the majority party put up a majority of the chamber or not? If not, then it needed some cross-party support in order to pass the legislation. And what you see is that, and this is the House of Representatives, most of the time, the majority party does not need help from the minority party to pass legislation. It gets support from the minority party, but it didn't need it to pass it. But on the landmark laws, more likely to need help. And there's the data for the Senate. So across all these six figures, not much evidence of partisan lawmaking. What's really interesting about these figures, to my mind, is that there's just no trend. I showed you some remarkable trends at the start of this of my talk on the rise of partisanship or changes in procedure, the extent to which leaders control the process now, and the extent to which they go around committees outside of the so-called legislative regular order. Big difference in how Congress works internally. But in terms of outcomes, there aren't trends. Most legislation garners support from both parties, including the important legislation. So then going beyond the aggregate patterns, we then wanted to know whether parties have the capability to enact their agendas. Are today's more cohesive parties better at getting the things they really want out of the legislative process? So based on the approach that I described to you before, drawing on leadership reserved bill numbers and the speeches given by the leaders at the start of the Congress, we have 265 cases over the period since 1985 that we then construct legislative histories. And here's the trends there. So first, I'm showing you total failure, where the majority party had an agenda item but couldn't pass it. Couldn't pass anything related to it. No legislation. Well, there is somewhat of an increase in failure, not an increase in success. Precisely the opposite of what you might expect based on the increase in party cohesion and centralization of power. Parties tick along and get some of what they want at a fairly steady rate over the whole time period. The least likely outcome, only 20% of the cases in the data set, is a clear win, where the majority party really got what it wanted. This is, out of the constructing this out of the legislative histories. This would be covered as a win in the newspapers and in the Capitol Hill publications like the CQ Weekly. So our next question that Jim and I asked, how do they succeed when they succeed? So dropping out all the cases of failure and looking at cases of success, either most of parties achieving most of their goals or some of their goals, how did they do it? Did they do it over the opposition of a majority of the minority party in both chambers? Mostly not, except for the 111th Congress under Barack Obama. That Congress, everything that the majority party achieved that was part of its agenda, was done so over a majority of the minority party Republicans. But that's it. It wasn't the start of a trend. It was just an unusual, remarkably unusual Congress. Now, the 15th was a little high. That's 115th. This was unified government under President Trump. somewhat high, but nothing like what we saw in the 111th Congress. The more typical way that a majority party succeeds is with the support of a majority of the minority party in either House or Senate. And even more typically, with at least one of the top party leaders of the minority party voting in support, meaning the minority leader or the minority whip. Since 1985, there have only been 12 majority party agenda items on which a majority party got most of what it wanted and did so over the opposition of a majority of the opposing party in both chambers and a majority of, and over the opposition of the minority party leaders in both chambers. So when this is it, these are the 12. So that met the 3 criteria, a real partisan steamroll. So we can look at them. We can see some very significant pieces of legislation here, like the Affordable Care Act, number 3, or number 1, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. They're going in reverse order from when they happen. They happen when they happen in unified government, but this is not a long list going back to 1985, obviously. And it's very hard to make the case that these are the most important laws that have passed since the Reagan years. Motor voter in the 103rd Congress, not a very important law. It did not transform either voter registration levels or voter turnout as people hoped it would. PAYGO was just a budget rule that only lasted until Democrats lost control of the chamber. The reauthorization of SCHIP, number 5, that's a significant, but the more important enactment relating to SCHIP was its creation in the first place in 1997 as part of a bipartisan deal between the Republican Congress and President Clinton. Note also the remarkable party reversals on 2 of these cases. The crime bill is on the list. This was a Democratic Party steamroll over Republican opposition that then presidential candidate Hillary Clinton had to apologize for because of the three strikes and you're out, and it's a contribution to the rise of mass incarceration. And you've got Medicare Part D, which Republicans created in unified government under George W. Bush over the opposition of most Democrats, which expanded Medicare to cover prescription drug benefits, outpatient prescription drug benefits, which the federal government had never previously covered. So sort of ideological reversals from what you might expect are on this list of 12. Here's a list of equally important laws passed during the same time period that were passed on a bipartisan basis. I think this is especially a problem for political scientists. We tend to think that the important legislation is the controversial legislation. But if you're studying public policy, that's not the case. Anyway, so here's a list of bipartisan achievements during the period. It includes all good policy, but it's important policy for understanding the shape of the law. This includes the historic 1986 tax reform, the Clean Air Act amendments of 1991 that successfully addressed the problem of acid rain, the welfare reform legislation that abolished AFDC and created TANF, the creation of the state children's health insurance program, the major deregulation of the financial services industry that happened in 1999, No Child Left Behind's expansion of the federal role in elementary and secondary education, the American Taxpayer Relief Act that ended the fiscal cliff and raised tax rates on the highest earning taxpayers in 2012, and the 21st Century Cures Act, which broadly transformed FDA drug approvals and significantly boosted federal funding for medical research. So most legislating that happens over this time period is bipartisan. The standout, unusual partisan cases are not the most important pieces of legislation that occurred during the time period. And there's a lot of very important legislation that occurred on a bipartisan basis, worked out via, in many cases, these are hard. This is hard bargaining that takes a long time. Doesn't usually happen in one Congress. That carries through over multiple Congresses before there is legislative success or breakthrough of this kind.